The first time the fire came, I was asleep. It was a Sunday in late August, and the air had that strange static you can't quite place until something bad happens. I remember dreaming about the ocean the way I used to as a boy when my father would take me fishing off the coast of California. But instead of waves, I woke to sirens, shrill, distant, then closer. My dog Scout was already at the window, whining tail stiff. Something was wrong. I stumbled out of bed, heart pounding, and when I stepped onto my porch, I saw the sky wasn't blue anymore. It was brown, stained with smoke, and the ridge across the valley glowed orange like a slow burning fuse. A wildfire. Coming fast. I live in a cul-de-sac on the edge of a suburban neighborhood called Willow Bend. A collection of pastel homes, two-car garages, and neatly trimmed lawns. Behind my property is a service trail that winds down the hill, cuts through a swath of undeveloped land, and connects to State Route 37. It's not marked on any modern HOA map, but everyone in the neighborhood knows it's there. It was my father who carved that path. Long before HOA bylaws and decorative mailboxes, my dad had the foresight to keep an access road open behind our land. He was a firefighter retired, but never really off duty, and he believed that every neighborhood should have more than one way out. When the first fire hit 5 years ago, that dusty, rutted trail became our salvation. Traffic was frozen. The front gate to the neighborhood was a bottleneck, with neighbors screaming, cars honking, and flames closing in faster than anyone expected. I opened my back gate, flagged people through, and we guided over a dozen vehicles down the slope. It was terrifying, but it worked. Nobody died that night. Some say that road saved the entire southern block. After the fire, I reinforced it, added gravel, cleared brush. My neighbors helped at first, though most quickly forgot once the insurance checks arrived and the lawns were green again. I never forgot. I couldn't. That night stayed with me. Every time I looked at the trail, I didn't see dirt, I saw escape. I saw second chances. So when the HOA tried to review property boundaries last year, I was suspicious. Their language was always vague, wrapped in bureaucracy, but it wasn't hard to see through the pattern. They wanted control over the land, the paths, the view lines. And that trail, it was inconvenient, messy. It reminded people that beauty here came with risk. I went to meetings. I raised my hand. I brought maps, old photos, even a letter from the county fire department affirming that the trail had been used during the previous evacuation. But the board, led by a sharp-jawed woman named Doreen Marshall, smiled politely, nodded, and moved on to landscaping complaints. That was their way, and I was just the retired Army guy at the edge of town. The man with a dog, a flannel shirt, and a stubborn streak. I guess I didn't fit their vision. Still, I kept maintaining the trail, quietly. I trimmed it, sprayed for weeds, and even installed a small solar-powered motion light for nighttime emergencies. I didn't ask for reimbursement. I didn't need a thank you. I just wanted people to have a way out. What I didn't know, what none of us knew, was that the HOA was preparing something else entirely. It started with a surveyor. He came one morning just after the 4th of July, driving a white pickup with no logo. He walked the line between my yard and the back trail clipboard in hand. I asked what he was doing. He said he was checking setbacks. Then he left. A week later, there were stakes in the ground, then orange spray paint, then silence. And then one morning, I heard the clanging of metal. Scout barked furiously as I rushed out the door. There, where the old wooden post had stood for decades, were construction workers drilling holes, pouring concrete, raising metal posts. A fence. A damn black wrought iron fence running straight across the trail. I froze. "You can't put that there," I said. One of the workers shrugged. "We're just following orders." HOA approved. Who, I asked. "Which contractor?" He didn't answer. But the clipboard on the tailgate had a logo, DM Holdings. Doreen Marshall again. I called the HOA immediately. Voicemail, then email, then a formal letter. No response. The fence went up in 3 days. 8 feet high, locked at both ends. No signage, no explanation. Just a cold barrier, slicing the lifeline in half. I stood at the edge of it that evening, fingers curled around the top rail, staring out at the trail I could no longer use. Scout sat beside me, ears low. The sun dipped behind the ridge, casting long shadows across the gravel. I felt helpless and angry. What if it happened again? What if the flames came faster this time, or the wind shifted? The memory of the first fire was still fresh, a scar on the land and in my chest. And now the path was gone. Because someone on a board decided it didn't fit their aesthetic. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay awake thinking about evacuation protocols, about how long it takes to reverse a car on a narrow street, about the way children cry when they can't find their pets. I didn't know it yet, but that fear, that instinct, it would prove to be right, and soon. The fence stood like a wound across the back of my property. Stark black iron, unnaturally clean, against the dusty trail that had once been our escape route. Every time I looked at it, I felt my chest tighten. It wasn't just an eyesore. It was a barrier between survival and disaster, between reason and arrogance. 3 days after they finished the installation, I received a letter. Not a certified one. Just a plain white envelope slipped into my mailbox with the Willow Bend HOA logo embossed on the top corner. Inside the language was vague, clinical, and smug, a courtesy notice informing me that unauthorized pedestrian activity has been observed on restricted HOA-managed easement zones. I laughed. Out loud. Not because it was funny, because it was absurd. That trail wasn't an easement. It was private land. Land I had stewarded for decades. Land my father had maintained before me before there was even a neighborhood before the HOA was a glimmer in a city planner's eye. Still, the letter came with a warning. Any further trespass or landscaping modification would be met with enforcement action, including fines or legal review. I placed the letter on the kitchen table, poured myself a cup of coffee, and stared out the window at the fence. That week, I walked the trail from the other side just to see how far they'd gone. The fence didn't just cut across my property. It extended over 3 other lots, none of whose owners had been notified either. I knocked on doors, spoke to neighbors. A few didn't care, it's just a fence, they said. One thought it was part of a new walking trail initiative. But old Mrs. Evelyn Green, whose husband had suffered a stroke during the last fire and had to be carried out through that same path, was furious. They didn't even ask us, she whispered, voice trembling. They just built it while we were at the grocery store. I decided to go back to the HOA office in person. Their office was a sterile suite in a strip mall off Maple Street, wedged between a dental clinic and a dry cleaner. The moment I walked in, the receptionist, a young man with overly gelled hair and an HOA name badge, looked up like I'd walked into a courtroom with a live chainsaw. Can I help you? I'm here to speak with Doreen Marshall. She's not available right now. Then I'll wait. He shifted uncomfortably. She won't be available today, but I can take a message. I shook my head. I'm not leaving a message. I'm a homeowner. And this is about a dangerous obstruction that was constructed without notice on a known evacuation trail. You know that, right? His eyes flickered. Sir, if this is about the rear easement fencing, you'll need to submit a formal concern via the portal. I did. I emailed. I called. I mailed. No reply. I'm not here to file a concern. I'm here to stop a tragedy. I don't know what he was expecting me to do. Shout, threaten, and instead, I pulled a binder out of my satchel and laid it on the counter. It had everything the deed to my land aerial photos before and after the fire documentation from the county fire marshal stating the trail had been an approved emergency exit during the 2017 fire. He didn't touch the binder, just leaned back and said, "You'll need to speak to enforcement. Ms. Marshall isn't." The door behind him clicked open. Doreen Marshall stepped out composed as ever in her tailored navy blazer and pale pink blouse. Her hair was perfect, her posture military grade, and her expression practiced serenity with just enough condescension to chill a room. "Mr. Garrison," she said, not even pretending to be surprised. "What a passionate visit. To what do we owe the pleasure? You know why I'm here." She smiled tightly. "Then perhaps you also know that the HOA board voted unanimously to proceed with the fencing initiative. The trail is not zoned for public use. It's a liability." "It's not public," I said. "It's emergency infrastructure, and it crosses my land. You didn't get my consent." The fence was built according to the HOA's right to protect community assets and restrict unauthorized access to shared zones. As per Article 4, Section B, I held up a hand. Don't quote bylaws at me. I've read them. And this, I turned the binder toward her, is a violation of safety protocols of easement access and of basic human decency. For the first time, something flickered in her eyes. Not fear, but calculation. "The board appreciates your concern," she said evenly, "but this matter is closed." I leaned forward. "You're gambling with people's lives, and I'm telling you now, when the next fire comes, that fence will kill someone." She blinked once. "Then perhaps you should encourage your neighbors to evacuate using the designated street exits like everyone else." I left, not because I was done, but because I'd seen all I needed. They didn't care, not about safety, not about community. This was control, aesthetic power, HOA politics masquerading as policy. 2 days later, I received another letter. This time it was a formal citation. I was being fined for damaging common land flora adjacent to community fencing. They'd cited me for trimming weeds on the trail weeds I'd been cutting back every month for years. That night, I sat on the porch, Scout's head in my lap, and watched the wind twist through the trees. The air smelled dry, wrong. I checked the fire weather warning online. It had risen to red flag level. It was coming. No one believed it yet, but I could feel it in my bones. And when it came, that wall of heat, that living thing made of flame and wind, that fence, would be a tomb for someone. And if that moment ever arrived, I'd have no choice but to do what was right, even if it meant breaking that fence myself. It started with the sky. I woke up before sunrise, my body restless, heart uneasy. The kind of unease that doesn't come from dreams, but from instincts sharpened by decades in the service. The air smelled wrong. Not just dry, but metallic like electricity, hanging heavy on the tongue. Scout was already awake, pacing the bedroom. He stopped when I sat up, ear-stiff eyes fixed toward the window. I pulled back the curtain. No flames, not yet. But the horizon glowed a faint crimson line, smeared across the mountains like a fresh scar. I dressed quickly, pulling on my old military field pants and a weathered black t-shirt, the kind with elbow room and breathability, the kind you'd wear if you had to run lift carry. I stepped out onto the porch with my coffee more from habit than comfort. Then I saw it, the first plume. It wasn't far, maybe 15 miles out, curling high and fast, turning the dawn orange, before the sun even had a chance, and I knew. It was coming. By noon, the local fire service had issued a level 1 evacuation warning for our region. Not mandatory yet. Just a suggestion to pack bags and prepare. But I didn't wait. I grabbed my go kit, packed with documents, Scout's food meds, flashlight tools. I called the neighbors who still spoke to me, Tom and Sarah Myers, old Mrs. Evelyn Green, the young couple with the twins on Hawthorne Street. I warned them it was time to get ready. Most were already halfway there. By 2:00 p.m., the wind shifted, and then came the text alert, level 3 evacuation, leave now. The fire had jumped the canyon. I could see smoke rolling in from the north. Helicopters thumped overhead, their engines growling against the wind like angry gods. Sirens wailed in the distance. My phone buzzed, non-stop alerts, calls, news, even an automated HOA message, reminding residents to use the designated evacuation routes at gate entrances. I laughed bitterly. That would be fine if those routes weren't already choked with outbound traffic. Willow Bend had only 2 paved exits, and both had merged into 1 lane due to road maintenance. The HOA had delayed for months. I'd driven past the backed-up line earlier. It wasn't moving. Then came the banging. 3 quick knocks, then more pounding harder. I opened the front door to find Emma Reyes and her son, Jonah Reyes, both red-faced and breathless. "Mr. Garrison," she gasped. "They're stuck. The gate's locked. There's no way out." Her words hit like a gut punch. I stepped outside, and what I saw confirmed everything I feared. A cluster of cars had pulled up near the back fence, the one that now stretched cold and uncaring across the trail. Parents were screaming. Children were crying. Someone was rattling the padlocked gate like a caged animal. They knew. They remembered the fire from 5 years ago. And in their desperation, they came to the road that had saved them once before. Except now it was sealed shut. I didn't speak. I didn't explain. I ran. Scout was already ahead of me, bounding through the brush toward the far end of the fence. The padlock on the gate clanged as I arrived. Behind it, neighbors clustered, eyes-wide faces, streaked with sweat and soot. The fire was visible now, an orange monster crawling down the ridge, hungry and fast. I looked at the gate, then at the fence posts. Then I made a choice. I ran back to the garage, yanked open the red steel cabinet where I kept my emergency tools, and pulled out the bolt cutters. Not the small kind, the heavy-duty 2-foot-long kind that could snap rebar if needed. I sprinted back to the gate, ignoring the ache in my knees, the burn in my lungs. Time wasn't a luxury. I wrapped the cutters around the shank of the lock. "Wait, what are you doing?" someone behind me shouted. I didn't answer. With one hard squeeze, the padlock snapped. The gate creaked as I swung it open. 30 people rushed forward. "Single file," I shouted, voice cutting through the chaos. "Take it slow, follow Scout. He knows the trail." They listened. They moved. Parents lifted kids. Teenagers carried pets. A woman I didn't recognize gripped my hand and whispered, "Thank you." I turned to help a man in a wheelchair when I heard a deep thundering crack. The sound of trees breaking under the heat. I looked up and saw the first flames breach the tree line, not 200 yards away. We were out of time. "Go," I yelled. "Go now." I helped the man down the trail, steadying his wheels as he bumped along the gravel. Behind us, the smoke swallowed the sky. Ash fell like snow. Somewhere nearby, a propane tank exploded, a thunderous boom that rattled the ground. It took us 18 minutes to reach the access road below, and then we kept running. Somewhere in that chaos, the coughing, the crying, the blaring horns, it hit me if I hadn't cut that lock, if I'd waited for someone to give permission or call a meeting, they would have died. And that's what I was still thinking when the fire trucks roared past us in the opposite direction, and I turned to see the entire back ridge of Willow Bend go up in a curtain of flame. I'd saved them. I knew I had, but I didn't know what it was going to cost me. Not yet. The next morning, the world looked like a war zone. The sun hadn't so much risen, as it had simply glowed dimly through a haze of ash and smoke. The neighborhood, or what was left of it, wore a coat of gray. Cars were scorched skeletons. Lawns had melted into patches of soot. And the sky. It was silent. Too quiet. I stood at the edge of the trail again, knees caked in dust hands, still raw from where the bolt cutters had dug into my palms. Scout sat beside me, panting but alert. His coat was streaked with soot, but his eyes were sharp, like mine. We had made it through. I had gone back up the trail once the last car cleared the bend, checked each property, knocked on doors, carried 2 elderly neighbors who hadn't been able to evacuate. When the last fire truck finally arrived at the top of the hill, the flames had already turned, sparing some homes, devouring others, including mine. My house hadn't burned to the ground, but it had taken damage, roof partially caved in, from flying embers, deck blackened, windows blown out. The inside reeked of wet drywall and scorched insulation. Still, I was lucky. So many others had lost everything. The cabin that once belonged to the Green family, gone. Tom and Sarah Myers' back porch, charred rubble. Even the HOA clubhouse, that pristine building at the center of every newsletter photo, stood blackened and hollow. The letters, Willow Bend, Community Trust, now half melted on the sidewalk like a cruel joke. And the fence, gone too. It had twisted, crumbled, and finally collapsed under the heat. All that remained were iron stubs in the dirt, each one bent like a dying reed. But by then, it hadn't mattered. I had already taken it down. I had done what needed to be done. That night, I slept in my truck. Scout curled beside me, my pistol under the seat, and a portable radio humming static. I thought I'd feel relief. I didn't. I felt hollow, exhausted. Not because I regretted it, I didn't, but because I knew what was coming next. They would come for me, and they did. On Wednesday morning, just 3 days after the fire, a woman in a gray suit knocked on the passenger side window of my truck. She was holding a manila envelope. Her heels crunched the ashes on the street like breaking glass. "Mr. Garrison." I rolled down the window. "That's me." She handed the envelope through the gap. "You've been served." I stared at the label. It was from the Willow Bend Homeowners Association, the HOA. They were suing me. On the first page, unlawful destruction of community property, vandalism, willful endangerment of HOA assets. I blinked. Not a word about the fire, about the people I helped evacuate, about the lives saved. Just cold legal language filed with the arrogance of people who think fences matter more than families. I wanted to laugh, but it wouldn't come out. Instead, I went inside what was left of my house, sat on the one surviving chair in the living room, and opened a bottle of water. Then I stared at the documents again. Endangerment. What about the danger they caused? What about the fact that without that trail, they'd be ashes on that hillside right now? I could have let them burn, but I didn't. I saved them. And now they were suing me for it. Scout nudged my knee. I looked down, saw his wide, patient eyes, and scratched behind his ears. "Well, buddy," I said quietly. "Looks like they picked the wrong man to make an example out of." Because what the HOA didn't know, what they never bothered to ask, was that before I retired, I wasn't just a soldier. I was a logistics officer, with 10 years of disaster response coordination under my belt. I'd written evacuation protocols for entire counties. I knew more about land use law and emergency access than the entirety of that HOA board combined. They wanted a fight. Fine. They were about to get one. I made 3 calls that night. First, to my old Army buddy, Marcus Langston, now a practicing attorney specializing in property law. Second, to Captain Miguel Torres from the county fire department, who still remembered the first fire and the trail that saved his own cousin back then. And third, I called the city zoning office and requested a full land use map, including all revisions from the last 25 years. Because I had a hunch, and if I was right, the HOA hadn't just blocked an emergency route. They'd done it on my land. That's when the real fire started, and it had nothing to do with flames. It was legal, relentless, controlled, and it was headed straight for the board. The summons didn't scare me, not in the way they hoped it would. I've been shot at. I've walked into minefields and walked out of courtrooms with my rank on the line. A few pieces of paper stapled together by a desperate HOA board, that wasn't fear. That was fuel. Still, I knew this would be a long road. Marcus Langston called me the next morning. He was already reviewing the documents by the time I picked up. "Dan," he said, "I've seen some ridiculous HOA suits in my life, but this one's Olympic-level petty." "They want me to pay for the fence," I said, staring out at what little remained of it. "They want you to pay for the fence," Marcus confirmed, "and compensate them for the emotional distress caused to board members by your unauthorized demolition of it. Never mind the fact that you probably saved half their lives." I stayed quiet. "They also added a clause accusing you of trespassing on shared HOA land," Marcus went on. "That trail, they're claiming it's within the HOA's management boundary. But I pulled the property lines, Dan. You were right. Your land extends 12 feet beyond the fence line they installed. You own that section outright." I didn't smile. Not yet. Not until we saw what a court would say. "You think we've got a case?" I asked. "Oh, we have a case," he said, and I could hear the grin in his voice. "What we need is the spotlight." And that's when the second call came. It wasn't from a lawyer or a neighbor. It was from a woman named Rachel Klein, a local reporter for Channel 7 News. She'd caught wind of the story through a post on a community Facebook group. One of the residents, Emma Reyes, I later found out had written a detailed account of the evacuation titled "The Man Who Cut the Fence and Saved Us." By the time Rachel called me, the post had over 40,000 shares. "I want to tell your story," she said. I hesitated. I've never liked cameras. I'm not the kind of guy who chases attention. But this wasn't about attention. It was about truth. About exposing how far a HOA would go to protect their ego, even after people's lives were at stake. So I agreed. Rachel showed up 2 days later, along with a small crew. She was young, sharp, and respectful, the kind of journalist who still listened more than she talked. We walked the trail together. I showed her where the gate had stood, where the padlock fell, where the fence melted into coils of useless metal. She recorded everything. "Why did you do it?" she asked me on camera. "Why risk a lawsuit?" I looked past her toward the distant hills still blackened from fire. The trees were skeletal, now shadows of what they'd been. "Because fences don't matter when the flames come," I said. "People do." That night, the story aired at 6 p.m. It ran again at 11 p.m. By morning, my inbox had exploded. Messages from veterans, from parents, from strangers across the country. Some were angry people who hated HOAs with a passion and saw this as proof of their corruption. Some were grateful people who'd lost everything in fires and wished someone had done what I did. But most of them said the same thing: "You did the right thing." The HOA board, however, doubled down. They issued a statement the next day, accusing me of reckless behavior, vigilantism, and deliberate defamation of the Willow Bend community standards. They claimed the fence had been undergoing safety evaluation and that I had interfered with a long-term safety strategy. They even threatened to sue Rachel and Channel 7 for misrepresentation. That was their mistake, because the more they tried to suppress the story, the louder it got. Within a week, the story had gone national. CNN picked it up, then MSNBC. Then a late-night host made a joke about the HOA that sued a firefighter for saving their lives, and the audience roared with laughter. But this wasn't funny, not to me, because I was still standing in the wreckage of my home fighting off anxiety every time Scout barked at a sudden sound. The fire was over, but the war had just begun. Marcus filed our countersuit that same week. We sued the HOA for destruction of private property for installing a fence on my land, obstruction of an emergency access route, negligence leading to emotional and physical harm, retaliatory litigation, and we didn't stop there. Captain Miguel Torres, the fire department chief, signed an affidavit confirming the trail had been recognized as a valid evacuation route by the county as recently as 2018. Mrs. Evelyn Green, Emma Reyes, and 5 other neighbors submitted sworn statements that I had personally saved them or their family members by opening that fence. And then came the email. It was anonymous, sent to Marcus through a legal contact. Inside was a forwarded thread between HOA board members, one that hadn't been meant for outside eyes. The thread included Doreen Marshall herself mocking my efforts, referring to the fire as a convenient PR storm for that old army hick, and most damningly admitting that the fence had been erected without a permit because no one checks the backside anyway. It was the nail in the coffin. When Marcus read it out loud to me, I didn't cheer. I didn't slam the table or pump my fist. I just exhaled, long and slow, because finally the truth wasn't just on my side. It was visible. The court date was set for 6 weeks out. The HOA tried to settle quietly, of course, under NDA. They offered to drop the suit if I ceased public commentary and removed all media content referencing the incident. I told them no. They could take their silence and shove it through the broken gate. It's strange how fast the world can take sides when the fire's already cooled. By the time the media picked up the story and the hashtags started trending, my fence hero, HOA humanity, and my personal favorite, let him cut the damn fence. I had become an unwilling symbol, a veteran, a neighbor, a man who defied bureaucracy to save his community. I was no longer just Dan Garrison. I was that guy who cut the fence and saved the HOA that sued him. But to me, I was still just a man patching a tarp over his half-burned roof while trying to keep ash out of Scout's food bowl. Marcus warned me that going public would stir the pot. They'll dig, he said. Try to smear you. Make you look reckless. Let them, I said. I've got nothing to hide. He paused. You're not doing this for revenge, right? I looked at the bent remains of the mailbox out front at the sidewalk still black with soot. I thought about Jonah Reyes, who now waved at me from his borrowed bicycle each afternoon. No, I said. I'm doing it for the next fire. And the next guy who hesitates. The offers started coming in interviews, speaking engagements, even a podcast wanting to do a 4-part series titled Gated Fury, the Fence That Divided a Town. I declined most of them, but I agreed to one a live town hall on public access television, organized by a group of local residents who'd had their own HOA horror stories. It was low budget, folding chairs, bottled water. But it was real. And packed. Doreen Marshall didn't show. Of course she didn't. But several of her former supporters did. And to their credit, some looked ashamed. I didn't know the trail was legal, one man admitted into the mic. I just assumed the HOA knew what they were doing. They didn't, I said. And they still don't. Then I pulled out the original deed, the one with the handwritten addendum from my father, notarized in 1982, specifically referencing the easement clause that protected the trail as an agreed-upon secondary access point in cases of natural disaster or emergency. Silence filled the room. The next day, the mayor's office released a statement. Not long, but powerful. All emergency evacuation routes, whether paved or unofficial, must remain accessible during wildfire season. We are working with county officials to review the actions taken by the Willow Bend HOA. Then came the petition. Started by a mother of 3, who had escaped through my trail, it demanded a citywide audit of HOA emergency preparedness plans and a ban on constructing barriers on known evacuation paths without explicit approval from the fire department and the city. Within 48 hours, it had over 200,000 signatures. And that's when the media really showed up. ABC, NBC, Fox trucks with satellite dishes parked outside my scorched lawn. Reporters with practiced smiles asking me to walk them through what you were feeling the moment you cut the fence. What I was feeling a responsibility no one else had the guts to own. I gave the same answer to every camera. I didn't cut the fence to be a hero. I cut it because no one else would. And because in a fire hesitation is death. Somehow, that line ended up on a t-shirt. Scout and I were even featured on a morning show, though he fell asleep in the green room and snored through half the segment. Meanwhile, the HOA was unraveling. One by one, residents came forward with their own grievances. Fines for sunflowers, threats over mailbox colors, secret board meetings, misused funds. Rachel Klein, the Channel 7 reporter who first broke the story, started digging. What she uncovered next cracked everything wide open. She found a series of contracts between the HOA board and a shell company, DM Holdings, the same name I'd seen on the clipboard of the workers who installed the fence. That company. It was owned by Doreen Marshall's brother-in-law. And the fencing project, it had cost 3 times the market rate. Corruption. Documented. Doreen denied everything, of course. Claimed she had no knowledge of family involvement and that the selection process was in compliance with procurement guidelines. But then Rachel got hold of the emails, leaked anonymously again. This time from a disgruntled HOA secretary who'd had enough. One email from Doreen to the contractor read, "Get it done by Friday. No permits, no flags, just make it disappear, it's an eyesore." Another said, "If Garrison complains, hit him with nuisance citations until he shuts up. He's a stubborn old dog." Those emails hit the news like a bomb. Even the HOA board couldn't spin it anymore. Residents called an emergency vote to suspend the current board. The turnout was historic. I didn't even have to campaign the fire, the fence, and the lawsuit had spoken louder than any speech I could give. By the end of that week, Doreen Marshall and 3 other board members had resigned. A new board was being formed, and neighbors were already approaching me, urging me to run. I told them I'd think about it. But first, there was still a trial ahead, because even though the world now knew what had happened, the law needed to speak too. And I wanted it to say this, that doing the right thing, even when it goes against rules written in ink instead of wisdom, is not a crime. The courthouse smelled like paper sweat and quiet judgment. I hadn't worn a suit in years, but that morning I ironed the one I kept in the back of my closet, a dark gray number that somehow still fit. Scout stayed home with the neighbor's kid, who'd taken to him like a shadow ever since the fire. I didn't want Scout in that courtroom, not because I was ashamed, but because I knew I'd need every ounce of focus. And Scout had a habit of growling at people he didn't trust. The hearing wasn't a trial, in the cinematic sense. No jury. Just a judge, a middle-aged woman named Honorable Ellen Torres, with tired eyes, precise diction, and zero tolerance for theatrics. Perfect. We were set in Department 32B property disputes. A narrow room with an old wooden bench that creaked when I shifted and pale green walls that looked like they hadn't been painted since the 90s. The HOA's lawyer was a sleek, suntanned man named Clifford Beale. Expensive tie, slicked back hair. The kind of guy who called objections just to hear himself say, "Objection." He started things off with a well-rehearsed speech about community cohesion, property damage, and irresponsible civilian behavior during emergency events. I stayed quiet. Let him dig his own grave with polished words and empty gestures. Then Marcus stood. He didn't raise his voice, didn't perform. He simply laid out the facts. The fence had been erected across land I owned. The HOA had no permit to build it. The trail was a known, historically documented emergency evacuation route. The fire was an imminent threat. People were trapped. He handed the judge photos. Maps? Video stills from doorbell cameras showing panicked neighbors at the locked gate, smoke in the background. Then he played the footage of me cutting the lock. It was grainy, low resolution, but unmistakable. There I was, bolt cutters in hand, opening the gate as terrified families rushed through the smoke. The courtroom was silent. Judge Torres looked at Clifford Beale. "Do you contest the authenticity of this footage?" Beale cleared his throat. "No, Your Honor, but context is..." She raised a hand. "We'll get to context. Continue, Mr. Langston." Marcus nodded. He brought up the emails next. The ones leaked by the HOA secretary showing Doreen Marshall directing the fence installation without permits, without authorization, and with deliberate malice toward me. That was when the mood in the room shifted. The judge leaned forward, fingers steepled. "Mr. Beale, were you aware of these communications when you filed the suit?" Beale hesitated. "They were recently disclosed. Yet your client initiated a legal action based on the claim that Mr. Garrison destroyed legally sanctioned HOA property." Beale adjusted his collar. The HOA board believed the board she cut him off acted in bad faith. They installed a fence on private property, obstructed a known emergency route, and then attempted to punish the very individual who mitigated their negligence. Is that a fair summary? Beale didn't answer. Torres turned to me. Mr. Garrison, would you care to speak on your own behalf? I stood slowly. My knees ached, but my voice was steady. I didn't want to be here, I said. I didn't want a camera in my face or a lawsuit on my doorstep. I wanted a quiet life, a safe neighborhood, a trail that worked when the front gates failed. I looked at the judge, not at the reporters in the back or the two remaining board members seated stiffly behind the plaintiff's table. That fire didn't ask for permission. It didn't wait for a vote. It didn't care about bylaws. And when people ran to that trail hoping it would still be open, I had a choice. I could have stood there arms crossed and said, sorry, HOA rules say no, but I didn't. Because I've seen what hesitation looks like. I've buried people who waited for orders that never came. I took a breath. So I cut a fence, and 32 people got out alive. The judge nodded once. Thank you, Mr. Garrison. Please sit. The hearing adjourned for lunch. I stepped outside into the courtyard and sat under a jacaranda tree. The air smelled faintly of burnt leaves, a cruel echo of that day. Marcus sat beside me, sipping coffee, eyes on his phone. You did good, he said. What do you think she'll rule? She's smart, she's also pissed. Not at you, at them. You can feel it. I didn't want to hope too early. But for the first time since the fire, I felt something crack inside me. Not fear. Not bitterness. Relief. When we reconvened that afternoon, Judge Torres wasted no time. She ruled in my favor. Not just a dismissal of the HOA's suit. She declared the fence construction an unlawful encroachment on private property that posed demonstrable risk to life and safety, and awarded me damages equivalent to the cost of the fence, the repairs to my property, and additional compensation for emotional distress and defamation. But she didn't stop there. She issued an order that any and all barriers on recorded emergency routes within city limits must be cleared within 30 days, and referred the HOA's conduct to the city attorney for review of possible criminal negligence and zoning violations. You could hear a pin drop. Clifford Beale collected his papers like a man who'd just been fired in public because, in a way, he had. The two remaining board members left without a word. I didn't gloat. I didn't pump my fist or clap Marcus on the back. I just nodded. Because justice isn't supposed to feel like a celebration. It's supposed to feel like balance being restored. As I walked out of the courthouse, reporters swarmed. I gave them nothing more than a sentence. I'm not the story, the people we saved are. But as I walked through the parking lot, an elderly woman approached me. I didn't recognize her at first. Then I saw the tear-streaked face, the oxygen tank clutched in her hand. It was Mrs. Rosa Alvarez, one of the last people I'd carried out during the fire, her small frame barely conscious as we bumped down the trail. She grabbed my hand. You didn't just save us, she whispered. You reminded this town what courage looks like. And for the first time in months, in years, maybe I felt the weight lift from my shoulders. Not all of it, but enough. Victory in court should have brought closure, but in reality, it opened something far deeper, a wound the neighborhood hadn't acknowledged in years. Like embers buried beneath the soil, the corruption within the HOA had been smoldering for too long, and now with the fence case burned through the smoke had become impossible to ignore. The first blow landed when the judge's ruling triggered an automatic audit of Willow Bend HOA's finances. It wasn't meant to be punitive, just procedural, the legal equivalent of lifting the hood after an engine fire. But what they found underneath changed everything. The city's zoning department discovered that DM Holdings, the shell company responsible for the illegal fencing project, had billed the HOA not only for the construction on my property, but for several other beautification projects, including $12,000 for a fountain that never existed, and $18,500 for native vegetation restoration that had allegedly happened during a drought ban. Every invoice had been approved by the same four names: Doreen Marshall, her vice president, Alan Spivey, treasurer Karen Brandt, and architectural chair Lyle Newman. None of them had professional backgrounds in accounting, law, or planning. What they did have were overlapping family businesses, 3 vacation homes between them, and a suspicious pattern of voting themselves discretionary spending powers in HOA meetings where no other members were present. The audit traced nearly $40,000 of missing community funds over a 3-year period, all hidden under coded budget lines like member benefit allocations and contingency landscape rebates. When the news broke, residents were stunned. The people who had fined them for having mismatched mulch or overgrown hedges were the same people who had been siphoning funds for years, hiding behind regulations, while secretly treating the HOA like a personal piggy bank. A second wave of resignations hit the board within 48 hours. Doreen Marshall went dark. No emails, no statements, no appearances. But she couldn't hide for long. Channel 7 aired an exposé titled The Gatekeepers' Power Fire and Fraud in Willow Bend, featuring leaked audio recordings from internal meetings, anonymous whistleblower interviews, and footage of HOA trucks delivering construction materials to a cabin Doreen had been quietly building just outside the city. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. She had constructed an off-grid escape with its own private access road while blocking the only emergency route for the rest of us. The State Attorney General's office launched a formal investigation. It turned out Willow Bend wasn't alone. DM Holdings had been contracted by 3 other HOA communities in the region, each with rising complaints about sudden enforcement spikes and mysterious accounting practices. The scandal had ripples, and those ripples started from one act of defiance, cutting a fence. Meanwhile, back in Willow Bend, a strange sense of clarity settled over the neighborhood. People began to talk to each other again. The neighbors who once barely nodded at the mailbox now shared coffee on each other's porches. We cleaned up what we could, raking ash from the yards, repainting mailboxes, repairing fences with permission. And amid it all, the trail behind my property became more than a shortcut. It became a symbol. Someone I still don't know who installed a small wooden sign at the trailhead. Hand-carved, slightly uneven, but unmistakably proud. It read Garrison Way, in honor of the path that saved us. I tried to take it down at first, feeling uncomfortable with the attention. But Scout barked at me like I was doing something wrong. I stood there for a long time, hand on the post, staring at those letters. Maybe the recognition wasn't about me. Maybe it was about the idea that one person, even a stubborn old man with bolt cutters, could still make a difference when everyone else froze. After the verdict, the new interim HOA board, now led by a former schoolteacher named Linda Miles, asked me to consult on emergency preparedness. I declined the title, but I agreed to help. We drew new maps, coordinated with the fire department, organized community drills. We even installed solar-powered emergency lights along Garrison Way. Not because of fear, but because of memory. We remembered what happened when warning signs were ignored and common sense got overruled by red tape. I gave a speech at the first fire safety workshop. It wasn't long. I just told them the truth. The fire didn't care who you voted for. It didn't care if your trash cans were pulled in by 8 a.m. It just came. And when it did, all that mattered was whether we stood together or stayed silent behind a locked gate. They clapped, sure. But what meant more was the woman who approached me afterward, one I'd never met, who simply placed her hand on my shoulder and whispered, "Thank you. My daughter got out because of you." I went home that night and sat on the rebuilt deck of my house. The air was clearer than it had been in weeks. Scout lay beside me chewing a stick like it owed him money. And I felt it. Not pride, not victory, but something deeper. Peace. Peace that the truth had found light. Peace that the fence was gone, and not just the iron one, but the invisible one that had divided this neighborhood for far too long. It was a strange thing returning to a life that had already burned. The lawsuit was over. The news cameras moved on. The HOA scandal made headlines across 3 states before it, too, became yesterday's outrage. But for those of us still living in Willow Bend, the aftermath wasn't something you turned off like a TV. It was something you swept, hauled, patched, and tried to explain to your children without letting the fear leak out of your voice. I rebuilt slowly. Not just the roof or the deck or the garage door that had half melted like wax during the fire. I rebuilt my sense of trust brick by brick. Trust in my neighbors. Trust that maybe, just maybe, this place could still be what it once promised to be, a community. The insurance helped, after some arguing, of course. They originally tried to classify the damage as partially preventable due to local governance decisions, but after the court ruling and a call from a well-placed city councilwoman, they changed their tune. I received just enough to repair my home, replant my yard, and finally install the sprinkler system I'd put off for 10 years. But money wasn't the part that mattered most. It was the people, like Emma Reyes, who baked me a fresh loaf of sourdough every Friday without fail, or Jonah Reyes, who began mowing lawns for half the neighborhood and used the money to buy fire extinguishers for the elderly. Or Mrs. Evelyn Green, who, after recovering from a mild stroke, began organizing monthly preparedness meetings in her living room with pie and laminated handouts. The trail was renamed officially. The city passed an ordinance protecting Garrison Way as a permanent emergency route with signage and a maintenance budget. A small bronze plaque was installed at the entry point, placed on a stone recovered from the fire debris. It read, "In memory of what was lost, in honor of what was saved, for those who chose action over apathy." I cried when I saw it. Not in front of the crowd, but later that night when the sun was low and the scent of burnt pine still lingered in the breeze. Scout leaned against my leg, sensing something he couldn't name. I didn't try to stop the tears. I let them fall for what we'd been through, for who we'd lost, and for what we'd found on the other side of it all. The new HOA Board, democratic, inclusive, even pleasant, invited me to their first General Assembly as a guest speaker. I stood in front of that room now lit with skylights instead of suspicion and looked at the faces. Some were new. Some were once hostile. All were quiet. "I'm not here to tell you how to run a neighborhood," I said. "I'm just here to remind you why it matters. Rules are important, but if they lose sight of the people they're meant to protect, they become something else entirely. They become weapons." I paused, looked toward the back where a boy was tugging at his mother's sleeve, bored but listening. "This place is worth fighting for," I said. "But only if we fight for each other." The applause was quiet but real. After the meeting, Linda Miles pulled me aside. "Have you thought about running?" she asked, eyes hopeful. "We could use someone like you." I shook my head. "I think my fight's done." She smiled. "That's what heroes always say." I walked home that night in the dark, deliberately leaving the flashlight off. The moon was full, casting silver light over Garrison Way. The silence wasn't empty, it was calm. I passed the new signage, heard the chirp of crickets, and I truly knew that the fear was finally behind us. Until the next fire. Because there would always be another. That's what life does. It tests you again and again. But this time we'd be ready. We'd earned that. And then, a week later, a final letter arrived. Not from a lawyer, not from the city. It was handwritten, the envelope unmarked. Inside was a simple card. "To the man who tore down a fence and built a future, thank you. You gave us time and you gave us a second chance. That's more than most ever get, a grateful stranger." I stared at the note for a long time. Then I tucked it into the same binder, where I kept the deed to the land, my father's letters, and the ruling from the court. Not because I needed proof, but because one day someone else will be standing where I stood in front of a barrier with the choice to act. And maybe they'll open that binder and remember that when the fire came, we didn't freeze. We moved. Together. Some mornings, I still wake up thinking I smell smoke. It's faint like a whisper at the back of the throat. Not always there, but always possible. I sit up in bed, listen to the wind outside, reach down to find Scout curled at the foot, breathing steady. Only then do I breathe steady too. The body remembers even when the mind wants to forget. But what has changed most isn't the smell of the air, it's the feel of the town. Willow Bend used to be the kind of place where neighbors waved out of obligation, not out of recognition. Garage doors closed faster than conversation started. And the HOA. It had been a silent wall between people, more effective at enforcing fear than fostering community. That wall, metaphorical and literal, is gone now. In its place is something slower, less perfect, but infinitely stronger. Rebuilding didn't happen overnight. For months, our streets were still scarred like burn marks on old skin. But with every fence rebuilt with permission, every porch light reinstalled, every smile offered without suspicion, we grew something that hadn't existed before: mutual care. I began volunteering informally, not as a board member, but as a neighbor with a truck and time. We organized brush clearing crews ahead of fire season, turned empty HOA flower beds into community gardens, helped install rain barrels and defensible space landscaping for the elderly. And on weekends, kids rode bikes down Garrison Way, the trail that was once nearly erased, now lined with solar lights and wildflowers that came back even stronger after the fire. Life, as it often does, grew right through the ashes. Linda Miles and the new board took everything seriously: transparency, communication, and above all, remembering. Not just the fire, but what it revealed. Every quarter they published meeting notes online. Every month they hosted an open forum, often outside under string lights near the refurbished clubhouse. That clubhouse, once a symbol of exclusion and privilege, was now ours. They reopened it with the picnic. No ribbon-cutting ceremony, no speeches, just neighbors bringing dishes, kids chasing bubbles, and someone, I think it was Jonah Reyes, plugging in a speaker that played soft folk music as the sun dipped low. I stood near the grill, flipping burgers and laughing with a man who'd once tried to get me fined for unauthorized flag display. Turns out he was just lonely, his wife had passed, and he hadn't known how to ask for connection. People are like that sometimes. Bristling on the outside, burning quietly inside. It made me realize something: fences aren't always built of metal. They're built of silence. And silence can be just as dangerous as fire. So we started talking, not just about bylaws and fire breaks, but about grief. About the people we lost. About what it meant to choose courage when comfort was easier. One night I was invited to speak at the local high school, not about the lawsuit, not even about the fire, but about what it means to lead when you're the last person anyone expects to. I stood there in the auditorium, staring out at a sea of teenagers in hoodies and headphones, and said this: I'm not brave because I broke a lock. I'm brave because I knew I'd be hated for it and did it anyway. That's what service really is. It's what parenting is, what friendship is. It's choosing someone else's safety over your reputation. And in the end, it saves more than just lives. It saves hope. A few of them even clapped. One kid came up after and asked if Scout had an Instagram account. I told him no, but I'd consider it. Weeks passed, then months. Scout got slower. I did too. But each morning, we still walked that trail. Garrison Way. Not because we had to, but because we could. One morning, as the fog was just lifting off the hills and the wild grass shimmered with dew, I stopped halfway down the trail and looked back. The town was quiet, repaired, alive, and I understood finally what we'd really built, not just a way out, but a way through. Through loss, through fire, through mistrust and fear. And at the end of that path, not just safety, but a second chance. Scout nudged my leg, tail swishing gently. Come on, old man, I whispered. Let's finish what we started. And together we walked on.